When I founded my first studio, I wasn't able to find a lot of information or guidance on how to approach a founding journey for games. Lots of information about tech companies or garage indies, but very little for game studios like those I had read about earlier in my career. Legendary names like Valve or Blizzard or id. Because of that, the feelings of loneliness on that journey were magnified. I've been lucky to meet a lot of founders between then and now, and each of their stories of starting a business are interesting and varied. I've wanted to work to share these stories and these founders so that the next person, maybe you, listener, are both better armed for the journey and a little less alone. My name is Carl Quo, and this is Founder Quest, a podcast about the journeys of starting a game studio. Today, we're talking to Derek Reese, founder and CEO of Chronicler, which was founded in 2023. That wasn't the easiest of years to start a game studio, believe me. I started mine then, and it was tough. But Derek has a long history of entrepreneurship, which you'll hear about in this interview, jumping between roles at studios and opportunities to learn, and then applying those lessons to new startups along the way. He spent time at Ascendancy Studios, Landfest, Red Hat, and most recently Microsoft, where he worked with Minecraft, PlayFab, and Game Pass teams. He comes from a bit more of a technical background on the journey, which is always kind of interesting and valuable to understand how tech folks approach the journey differently than product or business or design folks. And then how they translate those technical skills into more CEO and product roles as they grow. I really enjoyed my conversation with Derek, and I hope you will too. So let's jump in. Yeah, let's just start with the first question.
Yeah.
And really, tell me about that moment, right? Like, and probably a little bit of the before, what led up to it, but like, tell me about that moment where like, you know what, I'm going to go on this crazy founding journey and start a company.
Yeah. So I was 5 years old and, you laugh, but it's honestly, it's true. I was one of those weird kids that, most kids were like, hey, I want to make a video game or something, right? Like, that'd be so cool. I want to go make video games. And I was like, I want to start a game studio. And my parents are like, what's wrong with you? Like eventually it led to my dad buying me a book on coding and stuff, so there was like some support there, but it was like, what's wrong with this kid, So it's just been something I always wanted to do. And I think so much of that really came from creating these like interactive experiences for my sisters. I got 3 younger sisters, and it would be Briar horses and Barbie dolls and a lot of Lego, building these fantasy worlds for them to explore and interact with characters and go on adventures. And my question to myself was always, how could I do this for every family? I'm having so much fun building these worlds, right? Turns out with video games, you can, and you don't even have to clone yourself. You literally just make a game and it's on every console in every living room, right? Yep. And assuming it doesn't suck, people play it. So it's just kind of been a thing. But for me, it was always like a hobby until somebody mentioned to me while I was watching them play the original Doom on an IBM PC. They were like, yeah, these guys are super cool. They own sports cars. And I was like, wait, they got paid to do this? Well, that's stupid. Who would pay them to do that? I want to do that. So Q, like 2 decades later, right, in the games industry. And yeah, I mean, it's just this whole combination of a journey, right? Learning all the things I felt I needed to be able to start a successful business, understanding things like product market fit, back-end development, scaling an infrastructure, cloud, leadership skills, right, is a huge one. I mean, that's still just like a lifetime journey, I think. But this isn't the first studio I started. There's been many multiple, from being an art director and founder from early studios. We shipped a Halo RTS game, which was really cool. We even pitched Blizzard on like StarCraft Ghost, right? Like did a vertical slice and everything at one studio. But every single time it was just like we didn't quite have the right people, or it wasn't the right market timing, or it wasn't, the right product or audience or something like that. And with Chronicler, it's the first one where, if you go down that like checklist of like, what do you need to have to start a company, right? Everything lined up, right people, right place, right time, right opportunity. And most of these other projects, right, they're short-lived. 3 to 4 months. I think the longest one lasted a couple of years, but it was kind of nights and weekends, and we knew it wasn't going to be something big. Chronicler's the one where it's like everything lined up. This is going to work, and it's just kind of been an incredible feeling.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always interesting when this is something that resonates a lot with me of like thinking about, okay, eventually I want to start a company, so what do I have to learn on all these jobs leading up to whenever that moment happens? Never really, you don't ever know like, oh, it will happen exactly on my fourth job, right? And so I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that process as you were like, oh, when I was coming, out of college and going into your career or whatever, uh, you must have had some checklist in your head of like, oh, I have to know these skills, and you went through a few of them. But how did you think about connecting? Oh, I'm going to go take this job, and that's going to help me learn this thing, while also just having to do a job and like have a job and income and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, well, that was like step one, right? Was like don't move back into the parents' basement for
Yep.
sure. And I think you can relate to that, right? Like it's just like, oh man, I want to be able to not have to do that. And I mean, there's like family history and stuff that plays into those decisions. For some people, that could be a really good decision. For me, it was like, no, I want to avoid that. I do not want to end up back there. So that was driver number one. But the second one was I'm a very opportunistic person. I don't like to look a gift horse in the mouth. If something comes along my way and it's an opportunity, and I feel like I could learn something, I'm not someone that's like, oh no, it doesn't look exactly like the opportunity I want. Right? Like, let me go explore this. So it led to some really interesting intersections, sort of the skill set I wanted to learn. Right? Like college for me, because I'd already worked in the games industry at that point, was what am I missing here? I know coding really well. I've done a lot of concept art and like mostly technical art type stuff. I can sit there all day and check poly counts on things and fix, normals and faces and things like that. But I realized my art skills were just super weak. And while I had no problem jumping into C code or writing Python scripts or whatever, I was just so far behind on just the game design and animation part, which I think are pretty intertwined. So that first opportunity was like, there are world class animation programs in Florida, especially
Mm-hmm.
because Disney, Universal, Nickelodeon,
Yep.
etc.
Yep.
And so I had that opportunity and was like, you know what, this is a long shot because I don't have the strongest art portfolio. I have directed some films. They've ended up in museums, so maybe they'll kind of go with that. And it worked. It totally worked. They were like, yeah, it doesn't matter if the film was, terrible, right? You were still shown in a museum. It was like well received and that sort of thing. And that shows us you have the gumption to go do this. So that was kind of step one, right? And then I was like, okay, what is the next weird opportunity I'm going to get? So I got an opportunity to go. Like it was just a friend from high school was like, hey man, remember how you taught me all this cool code stuff? I got a job doing that, and we need to hire people. Do you want to come work on this? And I was like, what are you doing? He's like, oh, we're making websites for Blizzard. Like, and other customers too, right? But like, I
Yeah,
was like,
yeah, yeah.
sold, man. I want to go make, Blizzard's new website. So we did a lot of that, and then from there, someone else reached out and was like, hey, man, we have all these like weird problems we're trying to solve at Red Hat. And somebody told me you were really specialized in like scaling teams and platforms. Um, is this something you want to try out? Right. So like every time it was just somebody giving me a weird opportunity, and everything felt really good about it. And even though it wasn't the exact thing I wanted to do, there was a path forward. So it's just sort of collecting stuff in whatever order felt like gave me the opportunity to learn the most amount of stuff. Not like, hey, I want to learn this specific thing next. Let me go pick only that, right?
Yeah, I think I've absolutely seen a lot of folks, myself included, who have taken that mindset of like, oh, how can I take this opportunity and turn it into the ability to learn what I want and take the next thing out of it? And maybe it's not what I planned, but like, unfortunately, life does not always come at us in the exact right order that we've determined when we were kids that we wanted it to come at us, right? So that's really cool.
Yeah.
You mentioned that this founding specifically for Chronicler, a lot of things lined up, and you're like, okay, we've checked all these boxes, let's go, right? Did you still find that, like, for this experience where you've founded it prior times, you've gone through it, that there was something that you had to really learn for this time around that you're like, I have now entered the founding journey of like, yep, I checked all the boxes, but there was a hidden fourth checkbox that I now need to learn how to check as well.
I don't think so, honestly. I feel like it is pretty simple in the fact that it's, people, place, and timing, right? and in place in our case being like the product market fit. Are you able to find that? And everything else is just a factor that leads into that. So previous times that I've, tried to look at starting a studio, right? Like I got a co-founder that wasn't a really good fit. They're really cool, right? A lot of fun to work with, but just weren't like the right person to bring it to market. Or the product we were working on was really niche, right? And like the niche is something we thought would grow. And then, 6 months later, it was like very clear it wasn't. We're like, okay, never mind, right? Like wrong thing. And we don't think we're going to be the ones to like blow the doors off of this niche either, right? It just didn't catch on as a genre or whatever. So even though we'd be like the second game in this new genre, the genre just isn't, right? And like it's been everything from like weird point and click adventures with certain gameplay styles to like StarCraft Ghosts, right? Like what would a third person shooter in a Blizzard universe look like? Overwatch, I think, was a better answer than anything we pitched for sure, by a long shot. And it took them a while to get there. So it was just we managed to check all the boxes for this particular time. And I think you said something really interesting earlier, which was like, hey, I don't know if this is the right job that's going to propel me towards what I need to do, starting a studio. For me, it's never been related. It's always been something of like, I want to start a studio. I have this target audience in mind of like, I want to make cool stuff for families, but what problem am I solving? How are we solving it? Like all of those things just ended up being a big question that we said either we have an answer and it's not a good answer. And so we need to wrap this up and can it, or we don't have the right people to solve this particular issue, right? So just lining all those things up. So, but I'm kind of curious, like, is that the same experience you've had, or is it more like the job itself informed the conditions for starting a studio?
No, I mean, I think very similar to you. I definitely take the same approach of what can I learn out of this job? Of I know I have the goal of starting my studio, but what is this opportunity, and what do I have the opportunity within it to learn that can help, right? And there's lots of times where what that is in retrospect was very different than what I thought when accepting the job, which
Right.
is great and unexpected, and you sort of roll with it. I think neither of my founding journeys have I had the clarity of like, this is exactly what I'm going in to do at the start of the founding journey versus when we hit incorporate. My journeys of both co-founder dating and starting the studio, I've learned a lot about what it is I actually want to do and the opportunity. Um, so it's interesting for me to listen to your times around the merry-go-round and like, here's things lining up. And I know it's this audience and then this comes together and that kind of stuff. It's not dissimilar from, my own journey, but it isn't one-to-one either, which is
Yeah.
really cool to hear. Right. One of the things that like, ostensibly what folks are maybe listening to this podcast for is the like, hey, what can I learn from this person? I'm thinking about founding a company, right? Is now the right time for me? Should I go down this route? And before we jump into talking about a whole bunch of details about starting the path of founding a company, what's the biggest sort of learning you have from this time around of making that decision of like, yep, now's the time I'm going to found Chronicler. We're going to do this founding journey. That when you talk to someone who's thinking about, am I at that decision point? Should I go and found a company? What would you be like? Hey, you should learn this from me in my journey.
Yeah. I think the biggest learning there that I would tell someone is don't wait. I'm an engineer by trade, and so much of that is let's go prove out, like make a hypothesis, but go prove it out. And then if it proves out well enough, you can go build it. And when it comes to building companies, it's the other way around. You need to go and just go test things out and then decide, okay, what do we need to build? A huge part of, I think, so many people's struggles moving from engineering to being a founder specifically revolve around that idea of your product market fit isn't about solving a technical problem. It's about talking to customers over and over and over again. And so you get a very clear picture of if you are solving their problem, or, in the case of like talking about games as candy, right? Are you making the candy that's interesting and novel enough for people that they want to throw money at you before you even have something built?
Yeah, awesome. So let's dive in and sort of like go one layer deeper on sort of a founding journey. Right?
Yeah, let's do it. Let's get in there.
So a big part, and you even mentioned it earlier, like a big part of going on a founding journey is both the choice to have co-founders and who those co-founders are, right? And that, I often compare it to dating and all sorts of stuff, because that is how my mind has decided to process that journey. But you even mentioned in a prior founding journey, you had a co-founder who seemed right at the start, and then on that journey ended up being not quite the right fit, which is to say, to cast no shade on who they are as a person and all that kind of stuff. Just like the opportunity, the business didn't line up with what skills and mindset they brought to it, right? And so, to dive into that, I was wondering if you could just sort of share what is your co-founder makeup for Chronicle.
Yeah, what's interesting is before I joined on this podcast, I asked my co-founder Rasmus, awesome dude, used to work at Valve, scaled a bunch of studios, shipped things like Forza and stuff. And I was like, hey man, what would you say if you got asked that question, right? What would you put in there? And I think a huge part of it is you don't know. You just really don't when you start that journey. You can test things, right? If you can Google co-founder dating, right, there's a lot of really great advice out there. And I think the big portion of it that isn't really covered is that it's still impossible to know. And in each of these cases with previous co-founders where things haven't worked out, it's not like there was anything wrong with the person. They were still super fun to hang out with, right? Great as a coworker, but something wasn't quite a good fit, right? Either they were excited to be on the journey of building a big company, but realized going through that process that, wait a minute, the scale is scary and it's not for me. They couldn't have known that in advance. There's no way for them to know. Or maybe they fell in love with a portion of the product that you eventually had to cut because it wasn't part of the product market fit. And it's like, hey, we can revisit this, but it would have to be 5 years from now or something, right? Because the market isn't ready for it. Well, some people, right, that's not a good thing for them. That's not what they fell in love with. And so they're taking the thing they love away from them. And you never want to do that, right? You never want to separate someone from something they love. So it's just time to say, hey, let's part ways if we're going to make this successful. So that's the big thing, is just, I think, if I would give that one takeaway, it's you don't know, prepare and plan for that, and make sure everyone's okay with that. If things don't work out, everyone should still end up in a really good place, still be friends, still be able to communicate, because at the end of the day, it's business, right? And 5 years from now, you could be on your own separate founder journeys, but hey, man, have you ever dealt with this investor or this scenario, right? You can still help each other out, still be a great support network for each other that way.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like that part of finding and balancing sort of that co-founder makeup is that sort of question of like, what do we all want out of this, right? And what are the guardrails, right? Like, if we get to a point where it's like our friendship or the business, right? Like, how are we going to have that conversation? How are we going to process that? Because oftentimes, folks go into these sorts of engagements with folks who they've known for a long time and likely have a friendship, right? And you don't want to put that on the line necessarily at, have a great business at the expense of a friendship, right? And I've seen a lot of different crews sort of navigate that. I guess one of the pieces that I'm curious about as you were starting this journey is like, I often frame it as like the founders at the end of the day have to be able to span the entire business and carry all of it on their shoulders, right? And oftentimes you're looking at like, okay, what does each person have as the background? Who wants to suffer the having to play the CEO and do all the fundraising? Who's going to own accounting, right? Like all those kinds of fun jobs, as well as the fun jobs of like who's going to do design and who's going to do engineering, right? And it sounds like you come from more of an engineering background. I'm curious, what is the background of your co-founder?
Yeah, it's interesting because the way that I would phrase it is you're really just looking for unicorns
Mm-hmm.
among unicorns. And when you have a startup that is at that level that can really perform, it's not a specific skill set you're looking for as much as a unicorn. You're like, oh my God, how did this person land in my lap? Someone where you just go, holy crap, I didn't know someone existed that could do this. So Rasmus, my co-founder here, is somebody who brings that to the table. He's ex-Valve, right? He built a lot of ecosystems in there that was really vital to how they run business today. So he knows how to build and support a platform, which is not something that's very common in the games industry, right? So already that's a place that we connect on and really relate and understand, and that's vital to what our business Chronicler is doing today. So that was something that was like, wow, I found a unicorn. And then add on top of that, right? Like he's shipped with Dota, he's shipped with Forza, and my team over at Xbox where I used to work had worked with his team. So we, even though we didn't know each other directly, like one on one, right? Like the teams had worked together. So by the time that we met, I was familiar with his work and I was already very impressed by it. And then, coming from the back end, right? Like I had a kind of friendship with his wife who also works at Valve, and she was like, "Oh yeah, yeah, no, like not just because he's my husband, but because he's an incredible human being. Like you guys need to go make something work here." So it's just like unicorn, unicorn, unicorn status all across the board, right? And that is something that's really rare. But to do a successful startup, I think you got to repeat that process like 5, 6+ times to build that early leadership. It's just like these absolute unicorns of people. Some of them you won't even know until you look at hiring them. They're just like a friend of a friend said, "Hey, you got to talk to this person." Your investor said, "Yep, that's the person you should talk to." You have some interviews, you feel like there's a fit, and you're like, "Hey, okay, you're strong where I'm weak." And we also have a perspective on the industry that we really share that drives towards this vision that we're building together. And that's the most important thing, is not just the skill set, I think, but finding the unicorns that make it possible.
Yeah, and so it sounds like you had familiarity with him because your teams had worked together, but you hadn't worked together prior to starting
Until we started the conversations, yeah.
Yeah.
So there was definitely some overlap there after I got to know him, but that was already at the point where like I had built the R&D side of Chronicler first, right? Like again, coming from an engineering background, here's a weird technical problem, let me solve that, right? And then we'll go from there. So at that point, I'd already been thinking like, here's the R&D I'm doing, here's the target audience and product market fit we're going towards. We see a lot of the key indicators this might be really successful. Let's just have some casual chats outside of work, right? And that led to kind of that co-founder relationship over time. But it took a long time. It took like a year of chatting to really look at bringing him on board as a co-founder.
Yeah, when you think about that, sort of year of conversations and sort of building that rapport, that trust, thinking through both what the business is and the relationship and all that kind of stuff. What do you think were the most important conversations that you had with him to figure out if they were the right, like, not even if they were the right fit as a co-founder, but if you two were right fits for each other as co-founders?
Yeah, I think it's learning someone well enough to find out the things that really truly piss them off, and really truly get them excited, right? Those emotional highs and lows, because you will ride that roller coaster on the founding journey. And finding those places, which you really only can find by getting to know somebody, right? Unless you're like super skilled at conversation, you're like Bill Clinton or something, right? Like it's just not going to be a thing that's going to be easy for you to do. So finding those, I think those really pivotal, emotionally charged points and having the conversations around them, and finding you align where it matters, and then finding as well that you align on the really base level like ethical and moral guidelines, long-term vision around company, around supporting people, around leadership. Those are all the places where if you align to the places where the emotions are really high and really heightened, then you kind of have some confidence built in going into the process that when it comes time to make really hard calls, which you will always have to do in a startup, that they're going to have your back, not just because you trust each other, but also because of just who they are as a person and how you mesh as people.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's pivot a little bit onto sort of the fundraising specific side of the
Is that
journey.
a pun intended there?
Uh, a little bit. I unfortunately am a human who often makes puns unintentionally, but then I take credit for it afterwards. So
Hey,
I don't
there you
necessarily
go.
think it. So
That's
yeah,
not that's not unfortunate in my book at all. That's a skill. That's a skill you
there we
make
go.
use of.
That's fine. Yeah, I don't tell intentional bad jokes. I just accidentally tell them.
There you go.
Uh, so when you were looking down, it sounds like you went on a journey where you're like, okay, I've done a bunch of R&D work. I feel I have really high confidence in the path that I'm on, in this product and this idea. You built your relationship with your co-founder, and you guys were aligned, and you're like, yep, we're going to do this thing, right? From there, presumably, you're like, okay, and now how are we going to get money to do this thing that we want to do? How did you think you were going to go on that fundraising journey, and how has that sort of played out differently?
Yeah. I mean, for us, we really wanted to bootstrap the whole thing. We kind of wanted to be in this place where we weren't really beholden to people. We knew eventually we'd have to fundraise at some point. You don't build $1 billion business all out of your back pocket unless you're the luckiest person on the planet. So we'd probably have to do that. So there was that place where like we knew eventually there was a conversation to be had. But if we could bootstrap it, we wanted to. And then what we ended up seeing is there was an opening in the marketplace where the timing for getting the product out became very accelerated if we wanted to hit that market timing, right? If we wanted to take advantage of that opportunity and saying, hey, we're going to move up our product release schedule by 2 to 4 years potentially, depending on how everything lines up. That's really scary to say, especially when you look at the bank account and go, yeah, that's not possible. Crap, we got to fundraise, right? So I think that was a big part of it, right? It's just like going in thinking, hey, we're going to be bootstrapping, and then, oh God, we have to fundraise way before we ever wanted to. It was just a huge surprise, but it's also that place of like one of those few business decisions where you make and you're like very confident this is the right path. Because when you see market timing and opportunity that opens up, like kind of what we're positioned around, you don't want to pass it up. You don't want to pass up that opportunity, and you're going to do everything possible to make sure you secure that and that you're, on time to the market and not like a super late riding like the second wave or something like that. So I think that's the biggest surprise right there. Is just that pivot from bootstrap to, oh God, we got to fundraise.
Yeah, for sure. Like I can, in my own experience, I've had a few moments of, oh, I thought this would work out one way, and now it's going to work very differently. I don't
Yeah.
know that I've ever experienced the like, oh, I thought my timeline was 2 to 4 years, and now it is much shorter than that. That feels like a really big change. And so, out of curiosity, within whatever detail you feel comfortable sharing, you started out bootstrap. You clearly worked, sort of on your own for a year. But how are you currently funded? How are you currently sort of paying for the development that you're
Yeah, no, I'm happy to talk about it. I think it's important to demystify these things for new founders because a lot of times you can Google and you'll get kind of parts of stories, but you won't get the whole thing. You'll miss some really key, pivotal informational bits that would help you on the journey. Like just to kind of do a callback to something we talked about earlier, knowing that it's called co-founder dating would have changed
doing?
so much about the early process for me because you can Google how to pick a co-founder and you'll get a selection of articles. But if you Google co-founder dating as a term, you get way more information from people who've done it beforehand. And just knowing that term exists and you need to look for it. And it's similar in fundraising where knowing the right terms to address your information gaps is huge. And so, for us to kind of come back around to the question, right? Like we weren't really certain how we wanted to raise funds. We just knew that, okay, if we're going to hit that market timing, we needed to. And what made it really clear was the way that the gaming market sort of collapsed in on itself in 2022 and 2023 and went, okay, publisher funding isn't necessarily the right approach for us because to get the kind of deal we want to land, we'd probably have to put up about half of the capital ourselves. And that would really hurt our like long-term market planning and approach. The second part of it is we'd have to invest a lot of money in a vertical slice that might put guardrails on our conversations with the publisher. And we wouldn't necessarily want to be tied to those guardrails if we needed to change fundamental things about the game to meet the market. So we're very, market and customer driven. So meeting the gamer's requirements is a different thing for every publisher. Every publisher has a different view on that. And we also have our own view on that. We didn't want to be beholden to that. So we pivoted over to raising money from like friends, family, founders, angels. And that's where we're kind of funded today. We do have our seed round. And so that's been really exciting and a really interesting journey to be on. So that's our first time into venture capital, my first time fundraising. And I have learned so much in that journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's sort of two questions I want to ask you, and I'll cue them up, and then we can sort of work our way through them. First of all, like one of the big mistakes that I made in my first startup was not sort of keeping my head on the swivel and understanding all the different ways you could potentially fundraise, right? Like, uh, you know, similar to you, I sort of looked at it, and this was in 2017, and I was getting advice about like, do I do publisher? Is there other sources of money, that kind of stuff? And I had talked to a friend, and he was like, you should do publishers because there are VCs, but they're total pain to work with. They're pulling out of the sector, right? Like, don't do that. And then I just sort of went heads down and focused on, to your point, all the things you need to do for a publisher. Right? Like they have very clear expectations of what you do. I resurfaced in 2019 and the funding world had changed. And what I was building was not a good fit for publishers anyway, because I had never asked that question. I just like, oh, publishers, I guess, is the only game in town, right? And so as you were like, okay, I look at publishers, I don't think I'm the right fit for that. How did you sort of educate yourself, learn, think about, find the other paths and consider them in that
Yeah. I mean, this is something every founder has to learn. And so I appreciate you being really vulnerable about that, because that's important, I think, to people learning about how to be a studio founder and create companies. But the other part of that is, I think, is not just being vulnerable, but being vulnerable enough to ask for help. And that's a huge part of it. I wouldn't be where I was today, and I think every founder who's gone through the game studio founding experience could say the same thing, without all of the help that I've received from amazing people in the industry. So I mean, people like yourself, as well as VCs who have the time and energy to invest in that sort of relationship. So like a huge shout out to Tom Hooper at Ace Cap, who's been a mentor to me and just an amazing friend. And every time I'm like, oh my God, what do I do? Right. I just go to him and he'd be like, oh yeah, let me go look at the deck. Let me give you feedback on this. Right. And he didn't have a pony in the race or anything. He was just like, I like doing this. I like founders. I like helping people. And there's a lot of helpers out there like that make a big difference in your founding journey. So just having that humility, I think, to just say, hey, I want to be vulnerable with you for a second. I don't understand this stuff. Who should I talk to? Is just a really important part of it, as well as turning around and saying, how can I be helpful as well?
When you think about looking at building up from the friends and family and then shifting into sort of the things you're learning on the journey to do your seed round, like what are those really big learnings on that journey of like going from friends and families and angels into this next more stepping into venture capital? What are, like you mentioned, oh my gosh, I've learned so much on this journey. Like what are some of those things that you've been learning about the differences and how to approach that next round of engagement on that stuff, and all of those kinds of associated uh, problem sets, right?
Yeah, I think one that it's different for every person. I think everybody has a different journey, and if you're a studio founder, or you're looking to start a game studio, and you want to know how to do stuff, the answer is there is no one right way. Some people will be like, "Yeah, man, my best friend was a VC, so he funded my company." Well, that's not helpful if your best friend isn't a VC, right? Like, it's a cool journey, though, right? It's a cool thing to talk about and get that advice from.
I thought everyone's best friend was a VC.
Yeah, I would just grow up and the kid down the road, and now he's running multi-billion-dollar fund. No, I mean, and that's just one possible way to go through that adventure, right? But other people will say, hey, I shipped a bunch of products and I built some stuff, really small things, and I was able to turn that around into funding for a big thing, which isn't a common story either, right? Typically in games, if you make small things, everyone's like, cool, you're good at making small things, nice job, and that's the end of the conversation, just awkward silence, right? Versus having this conversation around, like, I want to go build AA games, or I want to be a first party and do AAA or something like that, right? Like, it's a different way. So just understanding there's different ways and different paths to find the success you need to get the funding that you feel is necessary to get to that next milestone, and just being open to what those might look like, I think, is the biggest learning and surprise I would kind of categorize there from that process.
I think one of the things that you've talked a lot about, as we sort of move into another topic, is the level of support that you've gotten from various folks to help learn, to help grow when you run into problems that you haven't seen before, and how important that has been for you in your journey and how much you value it. Um, I really would love to dig into that a bit and sort of understand, when you think about your journey as a founder, um, what do you see as your biggest support structures for yourself?
Yeah. I would say the first one would be my wife, 1,000%. If your immediate family is not on board with what you're doing in every way, you're going to have a hell of a ride, and it's not necessarily going to go well. And that's something that I bring up with all of my employees, that I bring up with my co-founder. I was like, hey, before you accept coming on board with the offer as a co-founder, I need you to sit down with your wife and set some ground rules, right? Like, ask her, is it okay if I talk about Chronicler every single day, right? Every single night before we go to bed? And she was like, hell no, I don't want to hear another word about it, right? And I was like, okay, and are you okay with that? Right? Like, have those conversations. In my case, I'm really lucky. My wife will tolerate all of my ramblings about this. She's an amazing and supportive partner, and that's integral to how I function as a person. So everybody has their own situation, right? But kind of resolving that, understanding, setting ground rules, saying, hey, what does success look like? What does a learnable failure look like? And then what is a failure that says, hey, we need to pivot and do something different? Either the startup needs to shut down, or et cetera. What are those points, and have those hard conversations up front. I'd say the second area where there's like a support structure that is really foundational, and honestly phenomenal is like we talked about earlier. The industry itself has people who are so charitable, so giving, who are willing to take time with you and just putting in the effort and energy to keep trying because everyone's busy. Everyone has cycles, right? They may not be responsive to an email, and then 6 months later, they made a New Year's resolution to help somebody, so they get back to you, right? You know that totally happens. But when you get beyond that initial step of like connecting to someone, just the amount of help that I've gotten. I mean, incredible people in the industry, people that whose names I knew as a kid, right, would like take the time
Mhm.
out and just be like, yeah, man, I did this stuff on Doom. Here's how it worked for us, right? And to share that wealth of
Mhm.
experience is just amazing. And that's really what you need as a founder, honestly, is that type of support that our ecosystem offers. It's there, just ask, be vulnerable.
Yep. I think I've always deeply enjoyed when I run into someone who worked on some really big game that I played as a kid or was really memorable to me, whatever stage of life I was playing, and then you're just like, wait, I'm in a conversation talking to someone who worked on Dungeon Keeper 2, and I played so many hours of that game.
Yeah.
What's happening or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And to your point, like almost everyone I've ever run into the industry, especially in those situations, are always so giving and so willing to share their experiences, but then also get weirded out and they're like, no, 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 but like what's going on in your life? I want to learn about you. And you're like, wait, but like I'm relatively nobody. Like why are you wanting to learn? But it's really nice and really great. Where do you have any places sort of in your role and founding journey where you're like, oh man, I wish I had more support on this, where you feel like you have a gap in support?
Yeah, absolutely. I thought a lot about, this sort of thing. And I feel like the place right now that I have that gap is I've been very fortunate in life to have mentors throughout my journey that in most cases have lasted, relationships that are like 4 to 6 years long. And people I still stay in touch with, right? Just in a different part of my life's journey now. And in this particular case now, I have such like a wide variety of mentors, but I don't have like one very stable, kind of like long lasting mentorship relationship. And that's something I kept thinking to myself is like, that's something that's been pivotal to every success I've had in life is I had some sort of mentor that had a stable, longer term relationship that was able to help me get there. And that's a place where like I now have an advisory board. I have all these wonderful people who are super smart, super experienced. I walk in there with like 15 questions, they've got 20 answers, including questions I didn't know I should have asked, right? But that also means they're very busy. If they're also successful people, they have lives, right? They have a lot of time that goes into their sort of day to day that isn't freely available. And I think that's the place where like I realized I kind of sat down and I was like, I'm at such a new part of my journey now and a level of success that I think it's time to bring on like that new and develop that new mentor relationship. And so I think just being open to those sorts of conversations will point me in the right direction.
One of the things that I'm curious about, because I think we've talked about how big and important your support structure is and how you sort of leverage it. But I would sort of want to maybe give folks listening a little bit of I guess, clear example. And it's a little bit of also an ask to be a bit vulnerable. But, what has been on this go around with Chronicler, maybe not the biggest, most giant struggle, but like, what's a big struggle that you've been dealing with as a founder, and how are you specifically been approaching getting support for it and getting through it, whether you have or not at this point?
Yeah, I think a big part of it is my personality is very people oriented, very relationship oriented. And for me, when I go into business with somebody, I like to get to know them pretty well and build that relationship and that understanding and that alignment. And that's kind of how I've learned to do things and how to be successful, either in a small company or in a leadership position in a big one. And when it comes to VC funding, you can't always do that. Sometimes people are like, hey, I don't care how warm of an intro you've gotten. I don't care that it's, my childhood friend that introduced you. Um, you are not a celebrity. You have not been on Time Magazine or, featured in multiple articles. So I've only got so much time for you. And that's a business choice, right? It's not personal. They don't have anything against me or against whoever they're talking to. That's just how they do business. I'm like, oh my God, how do I deal with this? Because I don't have time to get to know them. I don't get to learn what it is they are looking for because every VC is different, right? Some VCs, they not only need to have a successful portfolio, but because of where they're at their career, they also need early wins and milestones that help them in their office, right? So like you need to be able to be a good fit for that as well. Or, some VCs have a particular thesis on the market that they'd like proven. And they want to see somebody who's able to rise to that challenge, and that's what they're looking for. But if you can't spend time with people or find a way to get that connection where you can kind of learn that information, you don't know how to have a productive conversation with them. So you go in, you've got 30 minutes to just kind of give it your best shot and try to learn those things at runtime, essentially. And that's just been really difficult. I don't like that. I like to help people. I like to be helpful to people. And when I'm in such a weird constraint, it's like, I don't know how to be helpful to you. Let's just figure this out the best we can. And it doesn't always work.
Yep. Yeah. Is there a way that you've been trying to deal with that, right? Like obviously there's only so much you can do for any given VC. It's not like you can suddenly turn them around. And so, when you are faced with that sort of internal, like, oh man, I wish I could do this, or oh man, that didn't go this way, and I don't like all these powers and skills that I've had, I can't deploy them. How do you work through your support network to tackle like even just that feeling of like, oh, what do I do now, right?
Yeah. A part of that is I think I just try to never say no to a conversation. A lot of founders will tell you, don't talk to VC associates. They'll waste your time. And I think they're right in the perspective of like, if you're trying to get money out of them, you never will. And that's not super helpful. But in my mind, that's not a good goal to have when you're talking with an associate. I think the good goal to have is, how can I be helpful to you? You're just starting your career as an investor. What is it you don't understand about the industry? What is it you don't understand about this process? Where do you want to go next? Like long term, do you want to continue in the VC world, or do you eventually want to start a company? In that case, like, how can I be useful to you, right? So just being open to any sort of conversation, right? Not just with associates, but whoever I'm talking to, students, game designers who eventually want to found a studio. Those are places where I think have been the most helpful. And it's become a point where it's no longer a surprise when someone reaches out, 3 months later and is like, hey man, this thing might be useful to you. And it's like, cool, I didn't expect that. I don't, that's not like why I go into the conversation. But I think that helps a lot in that place, right? Talking to other founders too, like sometimes if you get really lucky, they'll have the time to sit down with you and be like, oh yeah, this guy on my cap table, he's having this problem right now. And it's really a thorn in his side. And your company might actually be a good fit for that, right? You could help each other out. That's incredibly vital information. And that's like that mutually beneficial relationship isn't an information tidbit I'd get out of the investor because we only have 30 minutes, right? But because the founder who's had those conversations with them shared that bit of info, it's like, cool, then this is something we can actually spend time on during the call that's useful to them and helpful. And framing things that way, I think, has been a really successful approach to it for me.
When you think about the horizon of your company and your journey, right? Like, unfortunately, in the founders journey, I recognize that many times those two things are deeply entwined. But when you look at that horizon, what are the big things that you're thinking a lot about? Like, what's occupying that mind share of like, oh man, this is on the horizon. I need to think about it a lot.
Yeah, it's the what keeps you up at night question, right? What keeps me up at night, I think, is the same thing that keeps all of my investors up at night, which is we put out this little tidbit of, in a couple of years, the Fortnite generation becomes parents.
Mm-hmm.
And everyone just goes, oh my God, you're right. You know what I mean? Like, holy crap, I wasn't thinking about that. The kids that were playing Fortnite as teens and just put all that time into it, they're like 22, 23 now. In 5 years, they're going to have kids. Oh my God. Right. And for a company that is making games for families to play together, just as cross generational, all ages games, like that's a huge inflection point. And if we're to do our business right, if we're going to be successful, we need to make sure that we time that really well and that we are shipping the right products for as those generations grow and learn to game together and expand. So that's just something I'm constantly, horizon wise, right? Like not day to day wise,
Mm-hmm.
kind of thinking about is like, what does that look like? How do we build relationships with that demographic? How do we ship the right experiences and games for them in 5 to 10 years?
Yeah, it's a big problem or big opportunity, I guess. Like,
Yeah, massive opportunity. Yeah, I love to spout the numbers off for my investors too, just to remind them these are big numbers.
Yep, big numbers. I have a feeling, based on your history as doing this whole founding thing a couple times already, but given the experience thus far, regardless of how Chronicler turns out, Uh, do you think you'd found another company after this one?
Absolutely, yes. I think it's something that is either in your blood or isn't, right? I think a lot of people can sometimes end up in this situation where they are part of a founding team. It's a ride they go on, but they know the whole time like it's not their thing. They're just doing it because they get to do the thing they love to do, and that's cool. It's an opportunity, sort of once in a lifetime opportunity. For me, it's in my blood. I founded my first company at age 10. I sold homemade Play-Doh door to door because I just wanted to learn how business worked, right? Like I did that during the day, and at night I was learning, Visual Basic and Fortran and COBOL. Just picking up the basics there, making games and building, web technology. Very early time, we had like dial up and stuff, right? So it was just, yeah, it's just something I've always done, and I don't think I could ever leave. You're either an entrepreneur or not, and I'm definitely an entrepreneur.
So I'd love to close out this podcast with asking you. I call it a lightning round. It's actually probably not that fast of questions, or rather, they're fast questions. I don't think they will be fast answers. But where this sort of set of questions came from is this is basically my starting point for co-founder dating. These were the
Yeah.
questions that I asked all the co-founders I've talked to as the basis of our first conversation. And so to start out with, what is your superpower in the
Yeah,
business sense?
I love these conversations because they're a question I ask other people to get a good frame of reference. And what I think my superpower is never the same thing as what other people tell me. And I think for me, the superpower that I kind of hear, I have the most often is I have this ability to get people super excited about things, which is something you need as a CEO and as a founder. And that's something that I think Steve Jobs, they would talk about like the reality distortion field, right?
Yep.
Like he would tell people a story about something, and they'd be like, yeah, totally. And then like after the meeting, you're like, what the heck did he just say? Like, what was that? You know what I mean? Like the
Yep.
whole time I was like, yeah, man, I'm on board, but I don't know what I'm on board with. And so it can be kind of tricky, right? Like because it's a big responsibility. If you can get people excited about an idea, the onus is on you to communicate it very clearly and very effectively to make a good use of people's time and not get them overhyped about something that they actually aren't that interested in.
Cool. Outside of your superpower, what are your biggest strengths?
I mean, this always goes hand in hand with like, what's your biggest weakness, right? Like, what's your biggest strength? What's your biggest weakness? And for me, I think it's both one and the same. So not to like steal a lightning round question from you, but it really to me is truly the same answer, and that is I am extremely stubborn. And so sometimes what that looks like is, I'll get feedback from leadership of like, this thing isn't a good thing to spend time on. So I won't spend any time on it during the day. But you can bet at night and at weekend, it's like if I think it's a good idea and I'm like, I just really need to have this answered, I'll just do it on my own time and get to that answer for myself. And sometimes I get an answer of like, they nailed it, they hit the nail on the head, they had some really good reasons for it, but they didn't have time to dig into it, right? So I learned some things. It was a good learning opportunity. But in some cases, it's also led to really interesting discoveries. And then I got to like very carefully bring it back up to leadership of like, I know this wasn't a good idea to really pursue, but I had this like, bug in the back of my head just like buzzing around. It's like, okay, I need to squish this thing and figure out, is this worth it? And it's led to really great opportunities. In some cases, it's been like, cool, it's good to know this was a good opportunity, but we don't have the budget for it right now. Right. So it kind of becomes that tricky thing of like, if you get really passionate about stuff and really believe in stuff, how do you also make sure you're keeping good relationship with some people that are involved in that journey, whether it's because it's the right timing or not the right timing? Those are all things you need to figure out. So that's led to this place where like I'm really kind of in love with the idea of innovating and creating new solutions to things and exploring new places, but also it can really trip myself up with those things if it's not the right timing or the right people for it.
Since you answered one and the same and took away one of the lightning round questions, let me reposition that. How has stubbornness been a big weakness in your journey at Chronicle?
Yeah, if you frame it specifically at Chronicler, I've been stubbornly patient. I think about some things where I should have ripped the band-aid off early on with the team. I'm someone who likes to give people the benefit of the doubt and likes to have a lot of good conversations around positioning for things. And sometimes in the startup world, you don't have time for that. And so inevitably, when you need to do something or feel you need to do something and you don't have time for it, you have to sacrifice something. And in this case, right, it's sacrificing lots of sleep, lots of energy, right? Like there's a lot of mental exhaustion I think that I was the cause of, because I wanted to make sure something resolved well. And it's a hard call. It's a personality, I think. For some founders, it's just better to rip the band-aid off and be like, look, you can't repair this, you can't fix this situation, it's just going to suck. In my case, I'm like, you know what, I can do better. I'm willing to lose some sleep. I'm willing to take a deep breath and be like, well, Sunday I'm going to go out to a mountain and just disappear and disconnect and be offline, because I had a really hard week trying to solve this problem that I probably shouldn't have been spending time solving, but we get a net win out of it, right? Like the loss is like, Sunday I'm gone, right? And that's an okay compromise for me. But it's definitely not something that I recommend for everybody. And you need to have, like I said, that great support network that's behind you that understands that that's the way you like to work, so that I could afford to go take a Sunday off, or, hey man, Saturday I'm just going out with some buddies to a concert and I'm not going to do any startup work because I had to deal with something really hard and difficult. And if you don't have your spouse's support, or an ecosystem of support around you, you almost can't take those breaks from the startup.
Tell me, what are your stress reactions?
Yeah. I think there's two sides to it. People don't tend to talk about one of them. The first one is sort of like, what do you do in the moment? Like, how do you react to things? But I think the second part of it is like, how does your body react? Because that's different for everybody, and that really does truly affect you. As far as the way that I react to stress is, for me, I'm stubborn, like I said, so I like to chew on the problem. I like to just face it head on and really think about it and talk about it. And part of that means I have to be really careful about how I talk about it with people. So it's asking like, hey, do you have spoons for this conversation right now? Hey man, I just really need to like grab a dump truck, right? And just like dump some information on you and see how you react to it. Is this a good time for it? Right? Having those sort of clarifying questions. So that way you're not just like unloading trauma onto people or whatever, right? Like make sure you're respectful with it. So that's a big part of it. And my wife is really great about that too. She'll just be like, look, I don't have the brain space for this right now. We can't have this conversation. I'm like, cool. I'm not upset by her saying that. It's just like, another time we'll chat about it. So I think that's the big part of it. And then the second part, like those physical reactions, that's a big one. It's something we don't talk about a lot, is like, I think as part of the founding journey, but it takes a massive toll on your mental health. I'm someone that lives with depression. I live with CPTSD from previous trauma in life, and getting to know myself really well and kind of like the way I handle those sorts of things, I think also give me a leg up for handling the founder journey. So I know that like if my brain is just like not in a very good headspace and I'm not feeling really productive, or like I can handle a lot of things, music's a really great thing to help steady me out. So I know like, hey, I need to clear my calendar and I'm going to have 3 hours without meetings, and I'm just going to have really good music on in the background, and I'm going to hack away at some of my high priority problems, right? Allows my body to make those adjustments I need to continue to handle the stress really well. So, and I think that's just like the TLDR of that is get to know your body as well as your mind as a founder, and that will prepare you for handling stress really well.
Yeah. And sort of last question in the lightning round, what are your upkeep needs?
I saw this question, and I was really curious about it. I actually have no clue what you mean by it.
Yeah, sure. So let me share mine as an example. So
Yeah.
one of the upkeep needs I know I have is uh, I'm someone who needs, when I do work. So like if I write a document or I do some analysis, or what have you, if I create an artifact, I need to know that it was useful to someone. Otherwise, my stress levels go up. I get really itchy. I will just become annoying. I will start pinging people like, "Hey, did that work? Hey, did that thing?" Rip all my friends after this episode comes out, because as the first episode, it will be nothing but me looking for. We've come to nickname with them within Gen T good boy points. I need my good boy points to say, "Oh yeah, you did a good job," right? Because otherwise, like if I am doing work that doesn't feel valuable, I'm like, why am I doing this work? I get really frustrated with stuff. So one of my upkeep needs that I express to my co-founders is, if I do work, you need to acknowledge that work. It doesn't have, you can tell me it's terrible. You can tell me to redo it. You can tell me, hey, I see it. I recognize you did work. I have to look at it later. But if you do not acknowledge that work or interact with it, I will go insane. And so that's what I sort of classify as my upkeep needs, is you need to pay that upkeep on Carl. Otherwise Carl go crazy. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of how I frame upkeep needs.
I love how you phrase that. Yeah, that's a really vital question. I feel like more co-founders should discuss with each other. Now that you've given me that example, it's really understandable. Yeah, I would say one of my upkeep needs is the ability to talk through stuff with people. And it's kind of like sanity checking, right? But a lot of times when I identify a problem, I'm the only one who's seen that problem. And this puts me in a situation where I'm coming up with a solution for something that other people still haven't recognized as a problem. And in a regular business environment, you get time and space to sanity check because there's a whole organization and structure around you. And so I function, I think really well with that, except when I get the pushback and it's like I'm me being stubborn of like, okay, you know, there's something I want to prove out, right? But in a startup, a lot of times you don't have the time. People are like, I trust you, go solve this problem that you see and that nobody else does, right? And a huge part of that is like, okay, then I need some sort of external validation that I'm not wasting time with this. And that, at least what I'm doing makes sense, that you can understand it, that you can follow through what I'm saying. And what that looks like on a day-to-day basis is if I'm programming, being able to rubber duck with somebody a little bit, right? And just get the like, nope, that makes sense. Or no, I have no clue what you're doing here. I wouldn't necessarily phrase it as like, I don't need so much like the acknowledgement of what I'm working on, but rather for the current problem space that I'm functioning in and that I feel like has a high level of risk attached to it. Is there somebody checking in on what I'm doing, right? And I want to go do that and not get the pushback of like, nah, man, I trust you, I don't want to talk about it. Okay, can you make time to talk about it, like, sometime later this week, right? Because it is really interesting to have that feedback from team members who are like, hey, man, this is something that is your area of expertise, and I don't want to give any feedback on it. It's like, cool, I don't need the feedback. I just need a sanity check. Like, can you follow the basic tenets of what's going on here? Because if it sounds crazy, it might actually be crazy. Who knows? We'll find out.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for spending time with me and answering all these questions. Before we close out, is there anyone you'd like to shout out? Is there anything you'd like to share if folks want to get in touch with you and learn more about your founding journey or Chronicler, anything like that?
Yeah, I'm always happy to talk to studio founders. You can just shoot me an email, derek@chroniclersoftware.com. If that's a journey you're looking on, something that is exciting for you that you want to take and you want to go on, go for it. Shoot me an email. Happy to chat. Happy to jump on and kind of work through where space you're in as a founder. Big shout out to the team at Chronicler. They're absolutely amazing. The timing could not be better because we're also ramping up our marketing efforts here. We're getting to a point where we're going to start doing some broader play tests than just like the small group of investors and friends and family. So it's, it could not be a more fortuitous time. So thank you, Carl, so much for having me on the podcast. And yeah, that's all I got.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for joining us. And we will be back whenever I decide the schedule for this podcast with another guest next time. Thanks for listening to the entire episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it with your friends or anyone you think could benefit from it, and leave us a positive rating or subscribe. This episode was edited by Christopher Delano. Music by Jake Hull, who's available for composer work for games. He's doing stuff for Jam & T Studios. He's great. He can implement stuff in Unreal 5. If you're interested in learning more about the Game Founder support community, go to gamefounder.org or email me, carl@gamefounder.org. Thanks so much.